I have the pleasure of sitting here with Margaret Archer, who has agreed to give me a few moments of her time to discuss social theory. Maggie, can you explain how you came to develop the morphogenetic approach?
My PhD thesis, which is the only piece of work that I feel still very ashamed of and have never published, because it was mindless empiricism, scaling people without listening to them. In other words, missing out on all the pay dirt, the gold dust that is there in your subjects. They were not allowed to be subjects, they were subject to metrification. So it was in an attempt to escape from that I went to France, where just as an everyday subject, I noticed what ordinary people, ordinary academic people would have noticed getting there, how very, very differently the two systems of education worked, what a different everyday experience they gave you of higher education, and how they induced you to work and to think in entirely different ways. So it was not that Britain, with its decentralised history system, was laissez-faire. It wasn't. Already the sort of managerial techniques of assigning you supervisors and supervisors controlling what you did had come into force. In France, where you'd expect that to be a lot more prominent, given its centralised history, it wasn't, except that everything had a backup. You didn't go to a lecture, you went and bought the lecture notes. You didn't just read the content of the lecture notes, you bought the accompanying booklet that told you what clocked up points in your overall mark awarded for what. And the realisation that a lot more of it was stylistic in France rather than substantive, as it was in Britain. And so I began to question, reflexively inside my own head, what accounted for this difference. And then I decided, well, if you're really interested in this subject, you ought at least to do something about it. I'd already started a second PhD on the development of the French civil service, as it turned out. So I thought, well, it can be a book. So I just absorbed what I could and started reading. This was a reading enterprise that lasted for 7 years, interrupted by producing 2 children en route that slowed it down. Reading the history of the 2 educational systems. Now, by educational system, this is not just a pretentious way of saying whatever exists there, school, teachers, books, whatever, that could roughly be called education. It had a formal definition that the parts should be connected together in principle, in a principled way. Didn't mean that they were all positively connected. Some of them were definitely negatively connected. You could not move from X to Y stage. And that at least some of the control should be at least partially governmental. That dated the French system back with Napoleon, the British system delayed until 1902 Education Act. Of course, that's disputable, but I'm using the same definition for 4 educational systems by that time. And like everybody's research, it begins, I think, with a contemporary problem that strikes you, and then you work backwards to its solution. So what struck me was the difference between the 2 systems. Okay, if that's a true statement, they really are different. What accounts for it? I summarise this by looking at the relationship between the parts and seeing centralized parts in France, all leading up to an apex, all change being top-down change, and the opposite in Britain. Loose connections between parts, change coming from various different kinds of agents, not just the Ministry of Education at the top, public instruction as they have called it in France, but also internal initiation from teachers, external transactions by interested parties like industrialists, and therefore very different kinds of consequences of these two structures of system. Okay, so that's what I call T1 and T4 in the morphogenetic approach, where you get a difference of structure affecting a difference in outcome. But what accounts for the difference of structure in the first place? Well, since in realism all structures are continuously activity dependent, and the origin of all these relationships between parts is dependent upon what agents do. What they do depends on what they want, and whether they get what they want depends upon what opposition they encounter. So this is what I call the T2 to the T3 stage, where agents, they can be two groups, they can be multifarious groups, there can be alliances between some of them. Their aims can be to change what exists on the ground, what they inherit, I'll come to that in 1 second, or to maintain it, because that's where their interests lie. Their interests, of course, can be both material, vested interests, or ideal or ideational cultural interests. Everybody acquires an inheritance of the doings of their predecessors, and in education it's their educational patrimony, and that is exactly the same for anything that one might investigate. Everything has a history. That history is a history of human doings, human thinkings, and human interactings. And that's what shapes the parts and the relationships between the parts, some of which are intentional. Napoleon undoubtedly intended that his educational system would serve his version of the state of which he was first emperor. Not that we ever call him the first emperor, but that's what he was. And statements very clearly of the kind, if the state has no need for people to be educated, they have no right to education. Clear as could be. But what was the context in which he said this? Well, of course, there can be debates about the relative importance of the political context. When he first said some of these things, he was not emperor, he was one of the 3 consuls. There can be debates about the kinds of models that existed ontologically and knowledge that he had of them epistemologically, upon which he drew. Both were important. He had, epistemologically and normatively, a huge admiration for the Jesuits, purely as an effective way of organising a corporation, as he put it. And his 2 models were the Jesuits and obedience. Obedience was critical as one of the 3 vows, and the army. So he wanted his educational system to be modelled on the army. He actually designed things like educational awards for good service, which matched 1-to-1 military awards for good military service. Now, that meant that you had a parallelism between the military, state officers, and the educational system, the degrees, qualifications it gave, calibrated horizontally with positions in the civil service, positions in the army. So you've got your three phases of one morphogenetic cycle there. The original context, what was drawn from it, and the importance there is that forgotten statement of Auguste Comte's, the majority of actors are the dead, in terms of what they leave behind them, or in colloquial terms, what agents get stuck with, and how they choose to reproduce it if they find vested interests in it, and the difficulties they have in trying to transform it if they find it's obstructing their aims and ambitions. Then there in the interaction between these groups, and the final outcome, which of course is not final, because T4 is the new T1 for the next morphogenetic cycle, and it answers the question, or my question in that context, well, what difference did centralization versus decentralization make to things like who could get in to these two educational systems? What did they get out of being in them for certain lengths of time? What options did they have? Did they all have the same experience? And occupationally, what happened to them upon school leaving or graduation? And that was morphogenetic cycle 2. Of course, it now needs the cycle 3 because the British system has not stayed decentralised, thanks to Tony Blair wanting much the same as Napoleon did. And the French has had to solve its problem that you cannot just have an educational system that serves the state with the market clamouring in the wings, and France, like every other developing nation in Europe, wanting to gain in market competition in terms that were completely nationally competitive, as symbolised in the great exhibitions that took place decennially.
A central focus of your work has been on reflexivity. Can you explain why this is the case and why reflexivity is such an important sociological concept?
There's a very interesting statement in The Possibility of Naturalism that Pascal makes when he says social forms are only influential through people, through people's activities, actions. I'm not drawing any distinction between those two terms here. And I think that's crucial for saving critical realism from charges of reification, but it is also problematic because what does the word through people mean? In a sense, it's obviously a metaphor, or it means by means of, via. Let's stick to by means of. It needs unpacking. People, actors, agents are not semi-permeable membranes that can just be affected by some kind of sociological osmosis. What makes anybody act? And sometimes the answers are biological, neurological, etc. Nobody, I think, would want to debate that. At other times, people are frequently in situations where they have to make their own decisions. Now, in my view, sociology is very bad at acknowledging that this is the case, it really is where empiricism, an empiricist authoritarianism rules. So take the example of pensioners living on fixed incomes which are not index linked in a time of inflation. Well, we all know this means they are worse off. That doesn't answer your question, how does inflation affect pensioners? Which is, I'm assuming, where we started this putative investigation from. Now here, researchers have been terribly authoritarian. They've said, well, of course, if you're on a fixed income and your money goes less far, you will live less well. Yes, obviously, that's what worse off means. But what do you actually do? Well, obviously, you cut the inessentials, you cut the luxuries. What's obvious about what's luxury? If we're talking about a married couple with children, grown-up children, living on in this situation, the phone may not be what they class as a luxury. They do not automatically trade off heating against eating or eating against heating, having ripped out the phone because a landline costs quite a heavy subscription. If their contact with their kids who may be living in different country, different part of the country, if that depends on the phone, let's assume they haven't got a computer and they don't know about Skype and all the rest of it, that is not a luxury, it's a lifeline to what matters to them. And crucial to some but not all realists, crucial to me, crucial to Roy, crucial to Andrew Sayre, is that people are creatures of care and concern. Things matter, and different things matter to different people. I've made a purely empirical statement that to this particular couple, keeping in contact with their children matters, and that they will forsake all sorts of other things in order to maintain this landline, lifeline to their concern. So, that may seem like a deviation, but it isn't. If people are creatures of concerns, if what matters to them, what they care about, is something that regulates quite a lot of their daily doings and life course, life histories, unity of life, as Charles Taylor calls it. How does it do this? Firstly, how do they come to have a concern for X rather than Y? Secondly, what are they doing consciously as subjects when they're thinking about how can I best realise this concern? Now, they're not engaging in cost-benefit analysis. They're not, unofficial ergonomics masters. They're simply trying to answer in terms of their common sense knowledge, what can I best do that will realise this? And of course they're fallible in this, very fallible. And they may have to pay quite objectively for their fallibility. For example, when a young couple decides we can afford to buy this house and service this mortgage at this particular level, they are fallible. They may be wrong. They may find that they can't service the mortgage, that it's foreclosed, that the house is confiscated, and sold. And that fallibility itself has consequences. They have failed on one mortgage, makes it less likely they'll be awarded another one, even for a cheaper property. They have a black mark across the nation's banks. We know all banks share their distribution lists and customer data. And so it is with our old couple. They pay for their mistakes. If you go too hungry, too cold, you get hypothermia, biology kicks in, and it can be terminal. So that's where reflexivity came from. How do people themselves, and they are the only and supreme arbiters on the currencies in which they work, and the costs that they're willing to pay, and the risks that they're willing to entertain. And people vary in this because people are different. So we are not looking for regularities, we're not looking for correlations, constant conjunctures, anything of that kind. We're looking for processes, mental processes. And that's where I started reading the great American pragmatists. The best thing I think they contributed was the inner conversation, which is not my invention as a term. It's theirs. And unfortunately, this tradition has been lost in American sociology almost entirely. Even the neo-pragmatists make absolutely no reference to it. And through reading them, I began to get some kind of shape to the idea of people having a conversation with themselves, which introspectively, though it's a term I've abolished in the first book I wrote, from introspection to the internal conversation, because there is no literal, in Latin, spect intro. You cannot literally look into yourself, and looking is very much in the empirical tradition, looking, seeing, recording, observing. They're all empiricist terms, basically, whereas listening, interpreting, concluding, evaluating, deciding are not empiricist at all. I don't think they belong to any tradition in particular. And so the rest of the first book, Structure, Agency and the Internal Conversation, was entirely exploratory. I thought up a list of 10 mental activities that I knew I went in for quite regularly, such obvious everyday ones. I think everybody goes in for some of them. Clarifying. Just something I've heard or read, or a word I've come across, don't know what it means, don't understand it. Clarifying is asking somebody else, using a dictionary, going to Wikipedia, doesn't matter what your source is. Your source may be fallible, of course, do. But you've clarified it to the best of your ability, in your view, nobody else's. This is where the sociologist loses this, not just authoritarian nature, but authority. As Norbert Wiley put it nicely once, the subject is a little god in his own mental life. So things like clarifying, decision-making, 2 universities to choose between. How does an 18-year-old, 19-year-old make up their mind? What goes through their mind? I had no idea, far too far away from that stage by then. So ask the subject. They have, and this distinguishes my version of reflexivity from, say the way it's taken up in literary theory. There is a first-person authorial authority. You know what's in your mind, I know what's in my mind. I can only understand what's in your mind through you telling me and me hermeneutically interpreting it. But it will remain an interpretation. Now, I maintain it's different when I am recalling and recording my own thoughts. It's a point I agree upon with Davidson. And that was the beginning, taking these 10 mental activities and just asking as diverse a group as I knew. When I looked down at the 8 or 9 people I jotted down for their very diversity, I thought it's not diverse enough, it's lacking in ethnicity, it's lacking in poorer groups anywhere in the community. And so I deliberately went to it was a hostel for young people who had been found truanting from school, into drugs, alienated from their families, living homeless, etc. And I just explored with them their internal conversations. Now, with these subjects, the last important point was, no, you don't take a technical term to them and say, I'm going to explore your internal conversation. They will quite rightly think you're insane. Say to them something like, I'd like to talk to you about how you make decisions in everyday life. And that's what I called the project or the subject. I don't think that's deceptive, because it was all about decision making. And the whole thing went on from there, and it grew as it grew. Very, very different approaches to how people made decisions, what concerns they had developed, how they developed them, which I think is a relational matter. Just been reading an article that calls me a personalist, but don't worry, I've been called everything from a functionalist to a personalist, but they're all wrong. I can live with that. So, it really drew itself from there, from each stage organically posing a research question that I couldn't answer within the parameters of the project I'd set at the time. So, apply for a new grant, take a new set of people. They're never really samples, they tried to maximise diversity, that's all. And go on from there.